Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This is Andre Davis with our new narrative, and today, this is episode 8 in a series that I'm doing within the podcast called Things I Wish I Also Learned in February. And today's title is They Didn't Make America Great, It Did. And basically the subject matter is basically what was so unique about America. And I think that's a good question, a question that is hardly ever asked, right? So, what was unique about America's early inhabitants, their actions, their ideas, and their values? I'll give you a second to think about it before I tell you. But before I tell you, I'll tell you what was not unique, okay? First and foremost, the hierarchical society which was brought over from England and transplanted into what we now know as America's southern colonies, right? By a group of people known as Cavaliers. They were staunch royalists, heavily devoted to the crown, the monarchy, and that way of life, living, and viewpoint. So I've said before in the previous podcast, a hierarchical society was basically God has all the liberty, the crown has a little less, the gentry a little less than the crown, and then so on and so forth until you get down to the slave, which has no liberty at all. And these societies are basically the societies that have basically formed human societies throughout our history. You can go all the way back to, I guess, Egypt with the Pharaoh, go to Rome with the Caesars, all type of kings, chiefs in Africa, chiefs in South America and America. They're all based on a hierarchy, right? And they all had slaves in that hierarchy. So that wasn't unique about America. The enslavement of an identifiable group of people by another people is not unique to America. Slavery goes back as far as people go back. You could trace it back 9,000 years before the founding of America in 1776. In Egypt you had slaves. In Rome, you had slaves. In the Dark Ages, you had slaves. In Africa, you had slaves. You had slaves in China, Japan. Like, slavery has existed as long as mankind has had two different groups of people. All right. One group of people conquering another group of people on their land is also not unique. Just ask the people who Alexander the Great conquered, Attila the Hun, the neighbors of the Zulu tribe in Africa, the Incas as their neighbors, right? So going in and conquering another group of people, taking all their stuff and ruling over them is not unique. You can look at the Moors in Spain. They ruled over Spain to a certain degree from 711 until 1492, a great deal of time there. So this is not unique. The fact that Americans came over to a new land and basically took over the land from the nomadic Indian tribes. Some of them, most you could say, were nomadic. Some were stationary, but that's not unique. Not dismissing the fact that people were killed, families destroyed, treasures stolen. But the point is, it's not unique to America. So what was unique to America was, and what was unique to America? What was revolutionary? What was new? Were ideas that kind of grew out of this egalitarian sense of community. Instead of a hierarchical society, they came up with an egalitarian society. And the people responsible for that were primarily the Quakers and the Puritans who migrated to what we now know as America's northern colonies, right? And out of that grew ideas of capitalism. So that is what made America unique. What was going on in the North, not what was going on in the South. Okay. And so certain people chose to embrace those ideas of the North. And some of those people were actually free blacks in 5 of the states, voted to ratify the Constitution of the United States. And that Constitution represented primarily the ideas of individual responsibility, liberty, capitalism, and the like, with a compromise given to the old school heads in the South concerning man's oldest institution, slavery. So with that said, I want to get into one of my favorite books, and it should be one of yours, Albion Seed by David Hackett Fishker. Amazing work here. He basically, in this book, he presents to you the 4 major cultures that migrated from England to America and established the country we currently know as America. And they are not just a group of white people, right? Which is basically what your history books would tell you. They were very different people. I mean, it's almost like saying, Russians and Belgians are the exact same people. They share the common language, but as far as social values, outlook on life, religious ways, speech ways, he goes through all this in the book, death ways, wealth ways. They're very distinct and different people. The only thing they had in common basically was during this time, they weren't black, right? And they weren't natives. So with that said, I'll dive into a portion of the book where he explains how the system that was brought over from England influenced life in America. So here we go. The great majority of Virginia's upper elite came from families in the upper ranks of English society. Of the 152 Virginians who held top offices in the late 17th and early 18th century, at least 16 were connected to aristocratic families, and 101 were sons of baronets, knights, and rural gentry in the rural gentry of England. So out of 152, you basically got 117 who were connected to basically either the aristocracy or the gentry. All right. In terms of their possessions, the adult male population of Virginia was divisible into several groups. At the top were the planters, who owned much of the land, most of the servants, and nearly all of the slaves in the county. The size of the Tidewater elite was relatively large by comparison with other ruling groups. In point of numbers, the Chesapeake gentry were more like a large continental nobility than the exceptionally small aristocracy of England. As many as 10% of adult males belonged to this group. Together, that 10% owned 50 to 75% of productive assets in Virginia. And at the time, that just meant land, right? There were no factories there. So below them was a stratum of yeomen who owned their own land and tilled it with their own hands, often with the help of a servant or two. This group of small freeholders was always a minority of Virginia's population from 1680 to 1760, almost 100 years. And in many counties, they were a very small minority. Overall, they ranged from about 20 to 30% of the population. So you got 10% of the elite, 20 to 30% yeomen, which we don't talk about at all in history, at least in my classes. And they were basically the people who owned small tracts of land, who tilled the land themselves. Right now, the bottom 60 to 70%, and this is very crucial and very important, this group of people, which no one ever talks about, history just dismisses them like they didn't exist, but they made up 60 to 70% of Virginia's male population. The bottom 60 to 70% of Virginia's male population owned no land at all. and very little property of any other sort. Now, why is this important? Because back then, if you didn't own any land, you couldn't vote. Simple and plain. So the people who own land voted. And if you were in the South and you had slaves, all of your legislation went toward propping up slavery. If you didn't own land, you were getting screwed by those who owned slaves who could vote, right? The landless majority included a large number of tenant farmers who worked the land of others and owned no real estate. Their numbers varied from one part of Virginia to another. In some neighborhoods, they were the great majority. Below these tenants were poor white laborers, servants, and black slaves who also could not vote, right? They were a rural proletariat who in most cases owned next to nothing, not even themselves, right? Now that's from Albion Seed. If you get that exact copy, it's on page 374. Now, we're going to contrast what was going on in Virginia with what was going on in the North, and particularly the state of Massachusetts, or the colony of Massachusetts. Okay, so here we go. Throughout the Puritan colonies, the middle class of yeomen, farmers, and artisans made up the great majority of the population. Slaves, servants, and tenants were comparatively few. The land distribution was very different in Virginia compared to the Puritan Quaker colonies such as Massachusetts. So we have to make it, if we're going to talk about history in its proper context, you have to look at it in its proper context. The people in the North had it was a very different country. You had small tract farmers owning their own land, doing their own thing in the North. And in the South, you had very few landowners, which means you had very few people who voted, and all of their votes went toward sustaining the institution of slavery, which was not unique to America. Again, slavery dates back 9,000 years, right? So, going back to the book. In Virginia, the land belonged to the crown. Access was carefully controlled by the royal governor and council. This narrow oligarchy of great planters was able to dominate the distribution of land for the better part of 2 centuries, right? So from 1619 basically up to 1818, they pretty much dominated. The result was a pattern of ownership opposite to that of New England in many ways. Again, I'm trying to draw a bright line between the life of those in the North and the life of those in the South beyond just slavery, right? Okay, now the average size of individual land patterns in Virginia was always larger than in New England, peaking in the years of Governor Berkeley's administration, which was the late 1600s. And the average tract of land was 890 acres. So can you imagine like Ma and Pa trying to manage 890 acres? No, you can't do that. So of course you deploy slaves on your land to make it profitable. Now, this material system supported the cultural achievements of Virginia's gentlemen. The system was a way of life, a social outlook, and all of that came from England to America, right? That system produced a degraded caste of poor whites and an exploited black proletariat. There were large numbers of desperately poor farm workers in the 17th century, 1600 Virginia. Some were indentured servants, others were tenants, a few were free laborers who wandered from job to job. The condition of working poor in the Chesapeake was as bad as it was in England. They slept wherever they could find shelter, and in sheds and barns and filthy lofts. They dressed in rough, raggedy clothes. Their diet consisted mainly of gruel, made of corn. And on top of all else, they were despised as the refuge of the earth by the people who exploited them. So not only were these poor whites getting screwed, the oligarchy couldn't stand them, right? So in all of Virginia and England, in all, Virginia and England were similar, right? Massachusetts was a world apart. The northern colonies is what made America unique. The northern colonies, with the ideas of egalitarianism, capitalism, individual freedom, individual responsibility, was unique to the world. This was the first time this happened in the world. That is what the American experiment is, right? So when you think about what made America great, or make America great again, you need to know what you're talking about. And I think I just helped you out there. What made America great was the ideas of capitalism, egalitarianism, right? What is killing America, in my opinion, is what came after capitalism. And that's the ideas of socialism. And you can't have socialism without first having capitalism, because socialists need something to take from somebody, which is all too often the capitalists. But I digress. I'll end it there. Hopefully you got something out of this. If you did, please like and subscribe. As always, in these episodes, I'm going to put a link to an organization, to a website that keeps track of all current organizations currently fighting the fight against modern day slavery and sex trafficking. Okay, so if you want to do more than just complain about stuff that happened in the past or stuff that happened to other people in the past and want to do something about it today, so we can finally, once and for all, get rid of this institution called slavery on this earth, I provided a link below and you can go and check that out. Until next time, see you later.